The mathematics of death changed forever in the frozen forests of Belgium. German veterans swore the American shells possessed supernatural sight. They burst precisely where flesh was thickest. They found soldiers behind trees, in trenches, even buried deep in snow. What they didn't know was simpler and more terrifying. Hidden inside each ordinary-looking shell sat a miniature radar system, no bigger than a coffee can, capable of sensing exactly when to explode for maximum killing power. This was December 1944, Hitler's final desperate throw of the dice. The Battle of the Bulge would become his graveyard not through superior numbers or better tanks, but because of a secret that made artillery 50 times more lethal. One unauthorized decision by an American colonel unleashed technology that rewrote warfare itself. The sky became a weapon. The air turned deadly. And soldiers learned that safety no longer existed anywhere on the battlefield. The moment arrived without warning on that frozen December morning. German infantry of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division pushed through deep snow toward the small town of Monschau. They expected familiar patterns, artillery that struck the ground, explosions they could predict, safe zones between the impacts where a man could breathe. Instead, death descended from directly overhead. American shells screamed through the morning air, but they never touched Earth. They detonated 30 feet above the tree line. Steel fragments showered down in perfect killing cones. Every foxhole became a trap. Every tree offered false shelter. Soldiers who had survived Stalingrad collapsed in seconds. Entire squads vanished under bursts that seemed guided by malevolent intelligence. The forest filled with screams and confusion as metal rain poured from an empty sky. Behind the American gun lines, Colonel Oscar Axelson had made the choice that shattered all rules. Without authorization from higher command, he ordered his 406th Artillery Group to load their most closely guarded secret. Shells tipped with proximity fuses. Inside each fuse lay impossibility made real. A radar transmitter smaller than a radio tube. Electronics that could survive being fired from a cannon. Circuits that measured distance to the ground and detonated at the precise height for maximum carnage. For the first time in human history, artillery could think. It could choose the exact moment to kill. The mathematics of destruction had been revolutionized in laboratories hidden across America. Now it was being tested in blood. The German advance stalled immediately. Veterans who trusted their training found all experience useless. The old rules no longer applied. Bursts came from overhead. Fragments sliced downward through any cover. No position offered protection. Panic infected the ranks. Reports raced up command chains. Soldiers spoke of shells with eyes, explosions that hunted them. Weapons that seemed to possess evil intelligence. What they faced was American science weaponized. Years of secret development, billions of dollars invested. The most complex electronics ever miniaturized, all condensed into a device that could fit inside an ordinary shell and make it 50 times more deadly. This was the weapon that would decide Hitler's last gamble. Not courage, not numbers, not tactics, but technology so advanced it seemed like sorcery to those who died beneath it. The Ardennes offensive represented Hitler's final desperate strategy. By late 1944, his Reich was crumbling from multiple directions. Soviet armies pressed from the east. Allied forces drove toward Germany from the west. Cities burned. Supplies dwindled. The Third Reich was bleeding out. Yet Hitler saw one last opportunity in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. A surprise attack so massive, so sudden, that it would split the Allied armies, force a negotiated peace, buy time for his wonder weapons to change the war's outcome. Operation Watch on the Rhine assembled over 200,000 German soldiers in absolute secrecy. More than 1,000 tanks, including the feared Tigers and Panthers. Nearly 2,000 artillery pieces hidden beneath forest canopy and winter fog. The goal was audacious. Strike through the Ardennes, seize Antwerp, cut Allied supply lines. Hitler promised his generals this blow would reverse Germany's fortunes. He assured them the enemy had grown complacent. The Ardennes sector was defended only by exhausted divisions and green replacements. His intelligence was not entirely wrong. American forces had indeed failed catastrophically to detect the German buildup. Many units stationed in the Ardennes were either battle-weary veterans sent there for rest or inexperienced recruits who had never fired weapons in combat. They expected quiet. They got hell. December 16th brought the storm. German guns opened at 5:30 a.m. across an 85-mile front. 1,600 rounds per minute hammered American positions. Communications collapsed instantly. Entire regiments disappeared under the sudden bombardment. The surprise was total and devastating. Wehrmacht forces surged forward through the chaos. Initial penetrations were deep and swift. American defenders, caught completely off guard, struggled to organize any coherent response. Many positions were overrun before occupants knew what hit them. But cracks appeared quickly in the German offensive. Despite the shock, American resistance didn't break entirely. Scattered units held vital crossroads and bridges with stubborn determination. Small groups of soldiers fought desperate delaying actions that bought precious time. In the midst of this chaos, Colonel Axelson faced his moment of decision. His 38th Cavalry Squadron was being overwhelmed by superior German numbers. Conventional artillery couldn't stop the assault. Following standard procedures would mean watching his men die. That frozen morning, Axelson chose to break every rule in the book. He would unleash America's most secret weapon, the device that would transform this battle and warfare itself. The proximity fuse emerged from America's most classified laboratories. Its security rivaled the Manhattan Project. On the surface, it resembled any ordinary artillery shell. But hidden within the nose cone lay revolutionary technology that seemed impossible to achieve. A miniature radar transmitter, no larger than a coffee can, sat inside each shell. It could sense distance to targets below and detonate at precisely the height where fragments would be most lethal. The concept was elegantly simple. The execution was nearly impossible. This tiny radio system had to survive unimaginable violence. Being fired from a cannon subjected it to forces 20,000 times greater than gravity. Temperatures inside gun barrels reached 3,000 degrees. At the peak of flight, bitter cold threatened to shatter delicate components. Rapid spinning could tear apart ordinary electronics. Dr. Merrill Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory led the development. His team worked from a building disguised as a used car dealership. Security was absolute. The urgency was desperate. They were racing against time and enemy technology. German engineers had actually led the race initially. As early as 1940, companies like Rheinmetall-Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes. But Hitler, obsessed with quick victories, canceled all projects requiring more than 6 months. The program died. German scientists dismissed the concept as too complex, too fragile, too unrealistic for battlefield use. That decision would cost them everything when American shells began bursting overhead in the Ardennes. American engineers rewrote the rules of electronics to solve the puzzle. Vacuum tubes from living room radios were shrunk to pencil eraser size. Glass ampules inside each fuse shattered under acceleration, creating tiny batteries that powered the radar. 4 miniature tubes, protected by innovative cushioning, sent continuous signals listening for reflections. When return signals grew strong enough, the fuse triggered. Steel fragments showered in perfect killing cones over everything below. The air itself became a weapon. By December 1944, American industry produced 40,000 proximity fuses daily. Over 100 companies joined the effort. RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Crosley Corporation abandoned peacetime production. Refrigerators gave way to weapons. Radios became fuses. The workforce consisted largely of young women working 12-hour shifts. They tested each of 130 tiny components with microscopic precision. Every solder joint was inspected. Every part was fired, tested, and tracked by serial number. No error was tolerated. The cost was staggering. Over $1 billion wartime dollars, second only to the atomic bomb project. But the result was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Artillery that could think. Shells that chose when to kill. Death that descended from empty sky. At Monschau, Colonel Axelson's forbidden order changed everything. His gunners hesitated only briefly. They understood the risks. Capture would expose the secret. Failure would mean court-martial for their commander. But the line was collapsing. The 38th Cavalry Squadron faced annihilation. The order stood. Shells containing miniature radar eyes slid into gun breeches. Lanyards were pulled. Cannons roared. What followed terrorized German veterans who thought they had seen everything war could offer. Advancing in tight formations, German soldiers suddenly faced fire with no predictable pattern. No safe angles existed. Shells burst precisely overhead, showering fragments downward in lethal cones. Foxholes became death traps. Trenches offered no protection. Veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, men who believed they had witnessed every form of destruction, were cut down in seconds by explosions that came from the sky. Reports raced up command chains. The German attack stalled, shredded by forces they couldn't understand. Survivors spoke of terror beyond comprehension. Shells that seemed to hunt them. Bursts that found them behind trees, behind walls, even deep in ditches. No explanation made sense. Panic infected entire formations. The carefully planned offensive began faltering under the weight of supernatural fear. At other points along the line, similar scenes played out. American artillery units received the same secret ammunition. The results were always identical. German momentum died wherever proximity fuses appeared. The weapon's impact extended far beyond Monschau. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne found themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered. Their salvation came through artillery armed with proximity fuses. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion fired 7,000 rounds in 2 weeks. German infantry advancing across snowy fields were torn apart before they could close distance to American lines. General McAuliffe's defiant "nuts" reply to surrender demands became legendary. But it was proximity-fused shells that made his defiance possible. Wave after wave of German attacks broke against overhead bursts. Soldiers advancing in the open had nowhere to hide from fragments raining down. The siege held. The vital crossroads remained in American hands. Further north at Elsenborn Ridge, devastation reached even greater scale. There, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held high ground against the 6th SS Panzer Army. Over 3 days, 160,000 shells thundered down. Only a quarter carried proximity fuses. Yet they caused more than half of all German casualties. Entire SS companies disappeared in blasts that turned forested slopes into killing fields. Survivors were forced to climb over bodies of their own comrades, only to be swept away by the next wave of airbursts. The elite of the Waffen-SS shattered against the steel storm. By December 21st, Eisenhower himself authorized full deployment. Restrictions were lifted completely. Proximity fuses were rushed to every artillery unit in the Ardennes. Self-propelled howitzers fired them in relentless barrages. African-American gunners of the 969th Artillery Battalion carved their place in history with devastating salvos that sealed Bastonia's perimeter. These men, often overlooked in historical accounts, wielded technology that made them among the deadliest soldiers on the battlefield. Everywhere the weapon appeared, German momentum died. The forest, once their shield, became a death trap as shells burst above trees, filling air with shards of metal and splintered wood. No tactics could counter this. No training prepared soldiers for death from empty sky. Christmas night, 1944, brought one of the war's most precisely documented artillery massacres. German troops, believing darkness and fog concealed them, began crossing the frozen Sour River. They moved quietly, weapons ready, expecting to surprise Americans on the opposite bank. Instead, shells detonated in air above the river, turning the crossing into systematic slaughter. General George Patton, driving his Third Army north to relieve Bastogne, witnessed it personally. His memoir recorded the devastation. 702 German bodies counted after the barrage ended. An entire battalion erased in minutes. The river behind them, fire in front, and death descending from above. It became one of history's few precisely documented mass killings by artillery. The proximity fuse had turned the Sour River into a graveyard. Similar scenes repeated across the battlefield. At Bastogne, German infantry advanced across open fields after demanding surrender. McAuliffe's "nuts" echoed with defiance. When the enemy attacked, proximity-fused shells burst overhead, scything through entire formations. Snow-covered fields that moments before had been alive with marching troops became landscapes of silence and bodies. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery and 969th Field Artillery laid down curtains of steel no soldier could penetrate. The siege held. The crossroads remained American. At Elsenborn Ridge, the battle reached its zenith. Germans threw their best forces into the fight. The 6th SS Panzer Army, the elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division. They stormed steep, forested slopes, determined to break through American lines. American guns answered with thunder. In 3 days, 160,000 shells fell. 40,000 carried proximity fuses. Yet these accounted for more than 60% of German casualties. Veterans remembered how entire companies vanished in seconds. Survivors climbing the ridges stumbled over piles of their own dead, only to be cut down by the next airburst. SS men trained to believe in their invincibility broke against invisible fire raining from the sky. Then came January 1st, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte. 900 German fighters rose at dawn, striking Allied airfields in a desperate attempt to cripple air power. The surprise was complete. Many Allied aircraft burned on the ground. But as Luftwaffe pilots returned, American anti-aircraft batteries were waiting. Their shells no longer searched blindly. They burst in air with uncanny timing. Proximity fuses transformed defense into massacre. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 were brought down by anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding, never recovered. It was the Reich's last great air assault, and it ended in ruin. Across the Ardennes, one truth became undeniable. The weapon that seemed impossible had reshaped the battlefield. Patton himself declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." In frozen forests, in rivers and ridges, in skies above Europe, the climax had come. The German offensive, launched with such ambition, was drowning in a storm of steel that detonated not where it landed, but where it killed the most. Hitler's last gamble was unraveling against not just American courage, but American science. The tide had turned forever. When thunder of guns finally faded, the Ardennes lay scarred and silent. The German offensive, once envisioned as a decisive thrust to Antwerp, had bled itself dry against American resistance and revolutionary technology. The human cost was staggering: 100,000 German casualties, 75,000 American, 19,000 Americans killed. But among those numbers lay another truth. Without the proximity fuse, the butcher's bill would have been far higher. By campaign's end, more than 200,000 proximity-fused shells had been fired. Studies after the battle showed that although they made up only a quarter of artillery fired, they were responsible for more than 60% of German casualties. A single shell bursting 30 feet in air was worth 10 shells that struck the ground. Artillery, once seen as a support weapon, had become the decisive arm of battle. The mathematics of destruction had been revolutionized. For Germans, the effect was not just physical, but psychological. Survivors spoke of shells that seemed to hunt them, weapons that found them no matter where they hid. Veterans who had trusted in trenches, thick forests, and stone walls suddenly found all defenses stripped away. Young conscripts, barely out of school, were thrown into a war where the sky itself betrayed them. Panic spread through formations. Units broke apart before reaching American lines. Orders were ignored. Some soldiers refused outright to advance into fields where air had become a weapon. Prisoners of war revealed the fear in their testimonies. They called it death from above. They described attacks where entire platoons vanished under airbursts, leaving only fragments of men and shattered equipment. Others told of forest battles, where exploding shells tore branches into deadly spears, doubling the destruction. No tactic, no courage, no training could counter it. For many German officers, the realization came too late. They were fighting not only American soldiers, but American science, American industry, and the relentless weight of a nation's innovation. On the American side, the weapon's rapid spread became a story of logistics. Within days of Eisenhower lifting restrictions, trains and trucks carried proximity shells to every artillery unit in the Ardennes. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired more than 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day alone. The 969th, an African-American battalion too often forgotten in history, created a ring of fire that made Bastogne unassailable. The technology had not only changed the battlefield, it had reshaped the role of those who wielded it. For the first time, artillery was no longer dependent on daylight, observers, or weather. Death could be summoned at any hour, in any condition. In January 1945, as the German tide receded and the front stabilized, the Allies took stock. Reports from the field told the same story repeatedly. Proximity fuses had multiplied American power exponentially. They had broken attacks that might otherwise have succeeded. They had saved thousands of American lives. What Hitler promised as his last great triumph had ended in silence and defeat. The gamble was lost. The Reich was bleeding out. And in shattered villages of Belgium, in forests where branches still hung splintered, survivors knew that something had changed forever. When snows of the Ardennes finally melted, the battlefield revealed more than shattered tanks and broken men. It revealed the arrival of a new age, The proximity fuse, once hidden in secrecy, had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a revolution. Generals across Europe recognized its impact immediately. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted plainly, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage alone, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." His words echoed testimony of General Hasso von Manteuffel, who confessed that the new shells caused panic even among his most veteran troops. For the first time, the German army feared not the man in front of them, but the invisible intelligence inside a shell. In sheer numbers, its effect was undeniable. 200,000 shells fired in the Battle of the Bulge alone. Between 15,000 and 20,000 German casualties attributed directly to the fuse. Studies showed lethality increased 5 to 10 times over conventional ammunition. A single battery could now halt a regiment. A single salvo could erase a company. The mathematics of destruction had been rewritten by technology, and the balance of war shifted irreversibly. Yet behind the statistics lay deeper consequences. The factories that produced 22 million fuses during the war became schools of precision manufacturing. Techniques of miniaturization and quality control pioneered for this program carried into the post-war world. The tiny vacuum tubes that once guided shells would one day guide satellites. Dr. James Van Allen, who perfected them, later discovered Earth's radiation belts using the same principles. The logistics networks built to coordinate 100 companies became blueprints for modern supply chains. Even the philosophy machines making decisions at the moment of impact would evolve into guided missiles, cruise weapons, and eventually every smart bomb of the modern battlefield. The proximity fuse was the ancestor of them all. But there was also the human legacy. In America, thousands of factory workers, many of them women, remembered long shifts soldering fragile circuits. They were never told what they were building, only that it mattered desperately. In Germany, countless young soldiers, conscripts, students, boys barely grown, died in ways they could not understand. They died in forests where trees themselves became weapons, in rivers where the air betrayed them, in open fields where the sky rained steel. Their deaths marked passage into a new and merciless era. The battle itself ended in late January 1945. Hitler's last gamble had failed completely. The Reich would never recover its strength. Yet echoes of those weeks carried forward through history. Eisenhower himself later admitted that had Germany possessed the proximity fuse on D-Day, the landings might have failed. Victory in Europe might have been delayed or lost entirely. That was the true measure of this invention. Not just another shell, not just another weapon, but the dividing line between old war and new. In the Ardennes, amid snow and silence, the age of technological warfare was born. The proximity fuse was more than steel and circuitry. It was proof that science could tip the scales of history. It was the moment when the battlefield ceased to be ruled by men alone and began to be ruled by machines that could think, however simply, for themselves. From that winter forward, every soldier who looked up at the sky knew a terrible truth. The air itself could kill, and the mathematics of death would never be the same again.